Okay, hi, I'm Margarita Kiwis, and I co-direct the Peace Innovation Institute here in The Hague. And who are you?
I'm Mark Nelson. I'm your co-director at the Peace Innovation Institute here in The Hague. And also, we co-direct the Peace Innovation Lab at Stanford that was the grandparent of all of this, I guess.
Yeah, we've been working together for almost 10 years now. It's a little bit amazing that we've been doing this so long. We started out at BJ Fogg's Persuasive Technology Lab, and BJ had the insight that it might be possible to work on a topic as challenging as world peace. He identified that we were entering into an era of mass interpersonal persuasion with all the technology that we have, and that we could change behavior at scale. And so, as I recall, you got involved with BJ around 2008. You got invited to Stanford.
March of 2008, yeah.
And what did you do then?
So the previous year, BJ had taught the Facebook class, which was sort of famous and sort of groundbreaking. Students created new apps on the Facebook platform that had more than 16 million downloads, if I recall correctly, in 10 weeks. And at that point, BJ realized that mass interpersonal persuasion was going to be a thing, that persuasion had been democratized. It wasn't just kings and emperors and presidents and media companies anymore.
Yeah. And I know that we then went on to do Peace Dot, which was a project with corporates to see how companies were creating peace in the world, right? And you worked with Facebook on that.
Yeah, the Peace Dot project came out of BJ's concern that these kinds of technologies were going to be abused both by industry and by government. And so he was looking for how can we ensure that we at least also get some positive use out of persuasive tech and some positive benefit to society. So when he went looking for what would give the most positive benefit, a more peaceful world was one of the things that he felt we could get some traction on, that persuasive technology could be useful for, and behavior design could support the design and deployment of that. So in 2009, we worked with Facebook around the things that got me invited to Stanford in the first place, which were that we could measure peace in a new way. That was another of BJ's key concerns, is if we were going to do something about peace, if we couldn't measure it, there was no point really doing anything about it.
So when you went to Facebook and talked to them about the peace data, what was the data that they discovered that they could identify as evidence of peaceful behavior on the platform?
They came and talked to us. One of the people working at Facebook at the time had been a previous student of BJ's, Mark Slee, and was one of the senior engineers, I believe, at Facebook at the time. Heard about what we were doing, came and talked to us, and after an hour or so of conversation, was still trying to wrap his head around the idea of what is all this peace stuff, because the conversation was wide and free-ranging. And at the end of that conversation, I said, well, you actually have peace data, and the key thing is you can measure it, and you don't even know that. And as an engineer, his eyes lit up a little bit around the idea of measuring and peace data. And I said, data? What data do we have about peace? And I said, for example, you can see the nationality of people who friend each other. You can see the gender of people who friend each other, the age of people, the ethnicity, the religion. People post these kinds of things in their profiles. And when they friend each other, that's a tiny little episode of peace, and you have immediately, in real time, the data for that. He got very excited about that. He said, I think that's something we could do, that's very tractable. He made a mock-up of the peace.facebook.com site, which is now facebook.com/peace, I guess. And had that back to us in 2 days and said, what about something like this? Could we put this up? And yeah, that was our first proof that we could measure peace in real time, that we could measure it at scale. And then, of course, it was measuring positive peace. And you should probably explain the distinctions we make about it.
So, turns out there are two kinds of peace in the world.
Maybe
Just
three.
like there are two kinds of people in the world. You know, people have innies and people have outies. Well, there are two kinds of peace in the world as well. There's negative peace and positive peace. And when people think about peace, they think, oh, you must be in conflict resolution or conflict reduction and things like that. Because typically when we read the newspapers or we read stories online, people who are peacekeeping are trying to end wars, eliminate violence, and so on. But it turns out there's a whole other sector of peace that's called positive peace. And the way I explain it is the way I think about health. You know, when we talk about health, there are people who treat patients who have cancer and acute diseases, right? And so there's a lot of research and a lot of interventions to help those people who are in a very bad situation and to restore them to health, right? So they're in this negative health space and we want to get them to be healthy. But then there are all these other people who work on prevention, right? So we think about exercise, diet, meditation, rest, all these things that we can do to take our baseline health and make it better. And so in the positive peace space, it's something analogous to that. How do we take the things that work in society and how do we make them better? So there are some countries that have like the six-pack abs of peace, right? They're really super fit in peace, like Scandinavia. And then there are other countries that aren't doing so well. And then some who are just fine, you know, they're a little bit flabby, but they're pretty healthy despite, you know, eating the chips and watching Netflix all weekend. They're all right. But there's always room for improvement. And so what we do is we work with entrepreneurs, innovators, practitioners on how they can create more peace in the world. And because we come from a behavior design heritage with BJ Fogg, we look at peace as how we behave with each other. So we have this engagement framework that we've developed over the years. And it's really about looking at this staircase of behaviors. So it's around awareness, attention. If we can get awareness and attention from each other, how do we build on that in terms of communication, cooperation, collaboration? And when you have people who are very different from each other and they can do all those things, they can also innovate. Because it turns out that innovation and the most innovative teams are the ones who are the most different from each other, but who can still work together, because that's where you get the best ideas. And so our work in peace also relates directly to innovation as well.
Hence us being an innovation lab that is working on the problem of peace.
Right, because big complex problems like climate change and others aren't going to be solved by the climate scientists alone. They're going to be solved by people from a lot of different backgrounds, a lot of different disciplines. And so how do we create the basis for them to be able to work together, right? So that's a lot of our work. And then I think the other opportunity is how do we design technologies to make it easier for people to be good to each other? So we can cooperate effectively, we can communicate effectively in constructive ways. And I think there's a lot of opportunity and a lot of room for improvement in social technologies now in that regard.
Yeah, we've been pioneering this whole field of technology that we call peace technology.
Yeah.
And there's two aspects to that. The one is the technology itself, and then the other is all these companies who are using technologies to do business and are generating peace and generating peace data, but just don't realize it, don't think of themselves as impact companies, don't think of themselves as contributing to peace. And let's maybe touch on both of those. The peace technology itself requires 4 components. You have to have a sensor that can detect when people are doing something positive and pro-social to each other, and can also ideally detect a little bit of the group identities of either person on either side. So if I text you a message, we've transcended or bridged the gender boundary, the age boundary, the nationality boundary. You're American, I'm Canadian.
I'm Californian.
Good distinction these days, and so forth. You know, and we could look into a lot of our other group identities. You know, I come from a Norwegian heritage. You come from a Latin and Native American heritage, and so on. We're bridging all of those boundaries just by the simple act of engaging with each other, not only with a text message, but with any other mediating technology. And the thing that is different in the world is now most of those technologies have a sensor that can detect that behavior happened in real time. It came from me, it was oriented to you. And that sensor can move the data through communications technology to computation that can make sense of the data, and then to some kind of actuator that can push into the environment and get a response in some interesting way. So these are distributed robotic systems, actually.
You're talking about cell phones.
Well, so not just about cell phones.
Yeah.
We're talking about any embedded sensor in the environment that can detect this kind of behavior. And we're talking about being able to stitch these sensors together across distributed platforms.
Yeah.
So these don't all have to be together in one package. If you have any of those 4 components and you can get them to connect with each other, you can build peace technology.
Yeah. I mean, when I think about that, and again, back to a health example, I think about my phone, because my phone can detect my motion, if I'm walking or running, or if I'm in a car, based on the accelerometer in the phone, and then it can track the number of steps I take, right? And I'm always trying to get my 10,000 steps, and then I look at the phone and go, oh, I've got 9,000 steps. I'm almost at my goal, and then that gets me, that triggers me to go and take that last walk so I can top it up, right? I've heard stories of people marching in the bathroom to get the last steps for the end of the day. So how do we do the peace
She'll
equivalent
knock
of
on
that?
my door in the hotel room and say, can you go for a walk with me? I need to get 1,000 more steps, even though it's 11 o'clock at night.
Right, right.
Yeah.
But it's interesting. So the CEO of Slack has taken a real interest in seeing how his communication platform is unintentionally perpetuating bias,
Mhm.
and how they can change the platform so that way women and underrepresented communities, in the employee base, feel like they're empowered to speak up on Slack, right? So what happens, because he's thinking, okay, we have this platform and we want people to communicate and collaborate. And then he's go like, wait a minute, are we getting the intended result that we want, right? How do we change the platform so that people who were inhibited in real life because they felt they didn't have a voice, how do we signal to them through the user interface and the whole experience that they do have a voice, right? And so it's an interesting challenge, but I thought that that was a great example of thinking about peace technology.
Yeah.
In terms of how do you be aware of whatever implicit barriers there might be for people to connect, and then how do you change the experience to make it easier for them to connect? And there's going to be a lot of trial and error.
Right.
And
A whole lot of our approach is we are taking a scientific approach to this. That means we're constantly doing experiments. That means a whole lot of this is trial and error. That's how we generate new knowledge in the field. Yeah.
yeah.
And the advantage of taking both a science and an engineering approach here, now that we can measure human behavior and measure it in real time out in the world, not having to pull people into a lab to do it, it gives us the opportunity to do many more of those kinds of experiments and to do them small so that before they affect a lot of people in perhaps an unintended way, we can learn a lot from them. So this ability to measure peace and to measure positive peace, maybe we should make one more distinction about the kind of peace we're interested in, because in addition to positive peace and negative peace, there's also active peace and passive peace. And we very much think about peace in terms of behavior, don't we?
Right.
Why don't you talk about that?
Well, I mean, as the physicists say, nothing happens until something moves, right? And if we want, the interesting thing about peace is that it's in everybody's ability to do that in terms of how we engage with people. And if you look at the sort of coaching that people look for in terms of their own personal growth, they want to be a better version of themselves. We all want to be a better version of ourselves. And if we can break that down into tiny steps, what does that look like? How good can I be to you, right? How in terms of active listening or appreciative inquiry, those are behaviors that I can do in terms of at the level of communication. In terms of collaboration, it could be how responsive I am to your email, right? Can I get back to you quickly enough? If we make a commitment on a calendar event, do I show up? Am I prepared? But these are all like micro behaviors and habits that we can get into so we can be better to each other, right?
Exactly.
And if we do that, then it just ripples out.
Right. And that ability to measure not only those tiny behaviors, did the behavior happen or not, but then to measure over time the sequences of behavior and the impacts of those sequences of behavior. That's the magic that makes our approach to peace work.
Yeah.
That's the underlying thing that we couldn't do a decade ago because we didn't have the technology to do it.
Yeah, and certainly in terms of coordinating people, how do you create incentives and rewards, right?
Right.
And we know now more that people get these tiny dopamine hits, right? When in terms of positive reinforcement, novelty, other means, and so we could use those tools, those levers, to incentivize people to be good to each other, right? But what's really interesting to me is these emerging business models, like these unicorns, like Uber and Airbnb, and they grow so fast. And they do that because there's this exponential growth in the business. And how do you do that? Well, it's bringing people together in these networks. But those networks of people only work if it's a good experience for everyone, right?
Right.
If the platform becomes one that you don't feel safe, you don't feel secure, it's not trustworthy, then you don't have to do it, right? Then
Right.
those business models can collapse, and we're beginning to see that with like online video game platforms, where now they're going in and saying, how do we address the toxic
Right.
culture of the game players, right? We have to fix that, so there's a remediation.
Well, that's kind of it, isn't it? That once you can measure positive behavior, negative behavior, you can measure it in real time, you can see it happening, that means you can also measure the business impact of it right away.
Right.
And so companies that might otherwise be uncomfortable looking at, well, do we have bias on our platform, like an Airbnb or an Uber, for example? It's a lot easier to look at some of those difficult issues when you can look directly through the issue to the business impact and go, oh, if we have bias on our platform, it's costing us X million dollars per year.
Right.
Therefore, we have to do something about that from a business perspective. And then we get back to the ability to measure it again. We can just run a bunch of experiments and see which experiments work.
Right.
We can try a bunch of tiny experiments very quickly. And this takes us back to why we're an innovation lab as well as a peace lab. It's that ability to do a whole bunch of experiments very quickly, look at the measurements very quickly and see, did this move the needle in terms of getting more of the kind of peaceful behavior that we care about?
Yeah.
And I think perhaps some other time we should go into persuasive technology in a little more depth, because as a technology for eliciting behavior, I think a lot of people are perhaps not aware of that. That's
Yeah.
something we should bookmark for the future.
Yeah, and it's, like the Starbucks incident in the States the other week, where the two African Americans were sitting there just minding their own business, waiting for someone, and
Somebody that they were meeting there.
someone that they were meeting there, and the barista called the police because of this implicit bias, right? And of course, for Starbucks, they have no way of measuring that until there's this PR blow up,
Right.
of course, in social media, because someone can record what's happening.
Right.
And so if Starbucks had a way to detect the experience, the customer experience in real time, then they would have said, wait a minute, we're seeing this, we need to correct it, and they could catch it early on before it exploded into a PR crisis, right?
And they could have seen perhaps 1,000 or 10,000 much tinier events before it led to a big blow up like that, and realized, oh, there's a pattern here.
We need to do some training,
Right.
we need to change the
Right.
experience, right?
Right. Our staff smiles this much at people that are similar to them and only this much at people that are different to them. They could have seen much earlier on, oh, we need to, yeah.
Right.
let's
And
a-
it's
let's
tough
address
because,
this.
again, these social technologies overlap with societal issues that have
Right.
always been there, that have been invisible to the people who aren't affected by it, right?
Right.
And so now that we have this, evidence, and you go like, oh, well, what should we do about it? So it's sort of a challenging time in society, because now all these things that it was like oh, you're just telling me a story, but I don't believe that it really happened because it's never happened to me. Now we have all this
Now we can
proof,
measure.
and
Yeah.
so
It
now
is.
companies are behind, and how do they catch up and design a customer experience that's really great, right?
And a corporate culture.
And a corporate culture that's really great.
So you asked a great question, so what do we do with this? And that goes directly to where, over the years, we've recognized that, in fact, people working in commerce are creating more positive behavior, and also creating it in a sustainable way between people who are different from each other, because commerce fundamentally is about getting people who are different from each other in some way or other to engage in a mutually beneficial relationship. Even if the only way they're different is,
Yeah.
I have a product and you need my product, and you have money and I need your money.
Right.
Even if that's the only difference boundary that's being bridged. But then, of course, as businesses start to succeed and grow, they grow supply chains, they grow distribution channels, they grow shareholders and regulators and so forth. And all of those are difference boundaries. And a business is, through one lens, a sustainable mechanism for building bridges across all sorts of different boundaries in societies that strengthens society, then strengthens the economy, strengthens the social ties and social fabric of the world. So a big part of our work is about how to leverage, first of all, how to make business aware that they play a much bigger stake in creating a peaceful world than they are aware of typically.
Right.
Far bigger than diplomats do, far bigger than the humanitarian sector does. And ideally, from a preventive perspective, they can be far bigger than the military as well for these kinds of things. As we look at peace data and look at what that enables in terms of a peace data standard for measuring corporate performance, for measuring social impact, for issuing things like peace credits and so on, this becomes the basis of all of that. Why don't you go into some of that?
Yeah, I know that, a couple of years ago we started looking at how do you measure peace, and then how do you
Do you measure the financial impact of it?
Yeah, the financial impact of it, because one of the dilemmas in peace is that there isn't a clear market signal that values it. So in some ways, peace is an externality, kind of like clean air, or a clean environment, clean water. You go like, well, I'd like to have that, but I don't know how to do that. But when you bring it in, it's no longer an externality. So we can actually explicitly measure it and measure the cost of the lack of peace, but also the value creation that happens when you have a peaceful environment or peaceful condition, just as you can measure the value of having clean water, right? Then you have a functioning society. You have less disease and all these things, right? So you have to tie the economics into it. And I know that
It's the only way to make it sustainable.
About 7 or 8 years ago, we started thinking about that and playing around with that, and then realizing that what we need to do was define what peace data was, and then establish a standard. And you and Rosanna and Lockley have just published a paper, Lawrence Lockley, on defining this peace data standard, and that's coming out in the Frontiers of Psychology. Right. Yeah. And then the next step is creating a governing body, and you're working with the City of The Hague, Central CBS, Central Bureau of Statistics here in the Netherlands, to start to catalyze that process, because part of creating a market signal for peace is we need to go into capital markets, right? To NASDAQ, to S&P, and all these people who invest in pension funds, corporates, and all that. And so it turns out that one of the pain points of, as you've been talking to investors, is that a lot of them have all this capital that they want to put to work in particular sectors, and it's really hard because they can't find companies that meet that criteria.
Not enough good investments, yeah.
Not enough good investments, and there's ambiguous criteria.
Right.
So one of the obvious things that needed to be built was a standard where investors could evaluate companies based on this common standard, and companies knew what they needed to do to comply to meet to that standard.
Exactly.
Right?
So what we're talking about, big picture here, is mechanisms for industry around the world to align themselves with the Sustainable Development Goals that their governments and the UN have agreed to over the years, and particularly with SDG 16, which is about peace and a more peaceful world and society. And then as we start going a little less macro,
right.
For companies to be able to measure the impact on their own business of increasing positive pro-social behavior inside their organization. So as we noticed about 3 years ago now, we started having senior executives coming back to us and saying, why did you confuse me with this peace business? Why didn't you just tell me I could measurably improve positive engagement between, for example, my marketing department and my engineering department? And because if you had told me that would go directly to my bottom line. So we now do a lot of this kind of precision piece inside of organizations as well, cultural transformation and so on. So we're operating at all of these levels, but the point in all of this is creating market signals for global capital markets to begin shifting where they put money, how they put money. Because in a day of trading, if a pension fund manager can't find good investments, he still has to invest that money somewhere. That structural impasse of just having to invest that money somewhere so that his retirees can retire, right. Means that a lot of unintentional damage can be done when there aren't good investments for him to do
And
that.
so, but also what I love about the Peace Data Standard is that it goes to the heart of behavior design, that we've learned from BJ. And we know that from BJ that if you want anyone to engage in a behavior, you have to make it easy for them to do so. So in this case, the behavior that we want investors to do is to invest in companies that are going to have this strong social impact.
Exactly.
Right? And so we're increasing their ability by giving them this standard. They go, great, I don't have to reinvent the wheel. We all agree to this common standard.
I don't have to do a deep analysis of every single company I look at and so on.
Right.
Talk about ESGs, ESG indices, and the difficulty around the S, or the social part of it.
Right. So the you know, in the investment world, there is a new type of index that's referred to as ESG. It stands for environmental, social, and governance. And it's a new type of index. It's a type of impact
Triple
index.
bottom line.
Triple bottom line. And so investors are now setting aside money in their portfolio to invest in ESG compliant companies. The dilemma, of course, is that they're finding it hard to find companies that comply with the social impact of ESG. They can find companies that have environmental impact, companies that are doing things toward good governance, but the societal one, the social one, is very difficult.
Right.
And so I think that what I love about the Peace Data Standard is that it provides that framework and that agreed upon, you know, foundation for both investors and companies. Because there are a lot of companies that, if they could surface their impact in a societal way, in a social way, then they would be eligible for all these pools of money that are just sort of in reserve, right? So it gives them a competitive advantage in terms of access to capital, either in the private sector or in the public markets.
And access to talent as well, as we see
Right.
at Stanford, all sorts of students willing to take a very large pay cut in order to work at a company that is making the world a better place.
Right. And so that's the other thing in terms of the societal shift, is younger generations want to both consume in a very conscious way, in a very responsible way, but also in terms of their work and their careers, they want it to have a positive impact in the world. And that's a shift, and as corporations are competing for young talent, how do they offer that to millennials, because it's a competitive marketplace.
Yeah.
So that's a dilemma. And also millennials as customers, because now they're beginning to vote their values, right? They're beginning to shop their values.
As employees, as customers, and as investors.
Right, absolutely.
And it not only goes to the talent acquisition, it goes to the talent retention. We've seen all sorts of students that have gone through our lab over the years who go work at Google for a few years,
And then they come
make
back.
a bunch of money, come back to us and say, now I really need to do something that has meaning and purpose because I didn't find it. Yeah, so, and this all comes back to metrics and the ability to measure these things again, to measure what we care about.
Right.
And so with the environmental part of the ESG framework, we typically look at carbon credits. That is the underlying unit of measurement that is now becoming a standard, slowly but surely. With the governance sector, the measurements again are pretty simple. How many women do you have on your board? We know that directly improves an organization's performance. What is the gender diversity and other kinds of diversity among your employees? And how does that percolate through, you can't say, well, we have more than 50% women in our employees if they're all in the typing pool and not in senior management.
Right.
So nobody has a typing pool anymore, do they?
No, you do your own typing, don't you?
Mostly, yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So, but you know what I mean.
Right.
So you want to see improvement across these group boundaries at all levels of a company as well.
Mm-hmm.
Those are pretty easy to detect and measure because they're one-time static things that changes when a person's position changes or when their employment changes.
Right.
The kind of stuff we do is much more real-time, much more dynamic,
Mm-hmm.
because it's the tiny micro behaviors that,
Right.
when I pass you in the street, do I make eye contact with you or not?
Right.
If I do make eye contact, do I smile or not?
Right.
If I smile, do I also greet you or not?
Right.
It's these
But
tiny
don't get
little
too
behaviors. But it's these tiny behaviors, right, that
Right.
make the difference between a good society that we want to live in.
Right.
These kinds of tiny behaviors.
Right.
Versus a negative or tension-filled society that we don't want to live in.
Yeah, but it's interesting because even in, when we talk to corporates, I talk to them about how to create an extraordinary customer experience.
Exactly.
And they're going like, because, a lot of products are just commodities.
Right.
And so what's your competitive advantage? How do you get customer loyalty? And how do you design an experience where your customer loves you? Where it was such a great positive experience. And that is how we operationalize this positive engagement,
Right.
even with the customer experience,
This is a big part of the opportunity.
Yeah.
As you mentioned, if people are just randomly in the street being a little too friendly to people, that can be a little bit creepy. But companies and the workplace and the work environment provide a great laboratory for us to test this as part of value creation behaviors.
Right.
And to very quickly test and correct our research question. How good can we be to each other? What if we try this? What if we try that?
Right.
And the results of being able to measure those micro behaviors of positive engagement between people in real time, being able to measure sequences of them, and then correlate those to value creation behavior, that's what we do in our labs. And going back to the standards body around the Peace Data Standard, we've got the carbon credit part for the environmental, we've got boardroom metrics and so on for governance.
Right.
What we're building is the Peace Data Standard part that allows us to issue peace credits, just like carbon credits.
Right.
That's where the huge opportunity is, not only for businesses, any organization can qualify.
Right.
So
Yeah, you know, it's
neighborhoods, cities.
Yeah, I mean, to me, what's interesting is when you look at how certain sectors have been set up, they can be very exploitative and extractive. You know, it's sort of that colonial
Exactly.
economic mindset, right? Where I'm going to take what I need and I'm just going to take it from you and not give you anything in return, and I
Right.
leave you more impoverished.
Right. And it's profit for me, and that's what goes on my books, and the fact that it's a loss for you, those are not my books, those are your books, and so that's,
Right.
for me, that's a negative externality. Sorry if that's your problem. Yeah,
Exactly, but now that we have more news and more information about what's going on in the world,
And now
it's-
that we're just fully interconnected, there's no other anymore.
yeah, it's not tolerable anymore.
Yeah.
Nobody wants to live in that world. Nobody wants to be that guy. And we can see all the conflict and suffering
Yeah.
that occurs from those kinds of economic systems.
Exactly.
And-
The other is us that we're just weren't aware of yet.
Right. So what I'm excited about in the work is that it's a very tangible way to reduce human suffering.
Right. Right.
Right? And by creating economies that are mutually beneficial and interdependent, I'd like to see a future where we design technologies that allow us to interact with each other in better ways. You know, I actually don't want to live in a world that's just full of AI and robots and I don't ever interact with anyone.
Yeah.
I want them to augment my experience with other people, but not replace the experience with other people.
Precisely. So as you're seeing, if you let us talk with each other about our work, we'll go on and
We'll
on.
go on forever.
What's interesting to me is also, and probably also to the viewers, is that you have such a big topic that you can handle. How would that relate to the series that we're shooting?
Right.
What are your
Very good
expectations?
point. Let's try and bring it back down to something else.
So, you know, you and I have been talking about our work for a long time, and one of the really cool things as it's come up is podcasts. And you know me, I love long-form podcasts.
As a mediating technology, as a peace technology, because unlike radio or something like that, we can see exactly who's listening. We can see some things about their group identities, and then we can get beautiful peace data that, hey,
Yeah.
just by doing this, we're bridging some of these difference boundaries.
Yeah, I mean, podcasts allow us to attract attention and awareness, right? And you know, our moonshot goal is to create a for-profit peace tech industry. And I'm looking at these podcasts as a way to talk to the world and to cast a spotlight on people who are doing really clever and innovative things in this sector. And they may not realize that they're doing that, but we want to be able to tell those stories. And it's going to be in, blockchain, AI, machine learning, new business models.
So many of these things are mediating technologies. People just aren't necessarily looking at them through that lens.
Right, and to be able to say, look, if you also do this is what makes it particularly special.
Right, and this is one of the challenges we've had communicating with people about our work, is that peace technology, people expect that it's a vertical, but it's not. It's a horizontal that cuts across all these different fields. Basically, anytime you're creating some kind of lever, some kind of device that increases your leverage to bridge a difference boundary, you're building peace technology.
Right. So if I think about my conversion funnel, the podcasts are a necessary step in that conversion funnel, because I want people to be aware. I want to get their attention. I want to get them to start thinking about the work. I want them to start appropriating the work. Please, steal this idea. I want you to go out and start experimenting with positive engagement as a design paradigm for innovation.
We'd like them to do it carefully because...
Well, yeah, we want them to do it safely, so we'll talk
Yeah.
about safe deployment.
Yep.
Because we need to create a community of practice, right?
Exactly.
And part of building that community of practice is having an audience, and then having opportunities for them to meet with each other and engage with each other.
Right.
Ways that they can learn over time how to work with our lab and our institute. And the other people I want to talk to are regulators and policymakers,
Exactly.
because they tend to be behind on the technology curve. So by the time they get around to addressing it, the technology's
late.
been out for 10 years and it could be too late. So how do we get regulators and legislators and policymakers to move up the learning curve as this new sector begins to emerge over the next 10, 20 years?
Right.
And
So-
so this is an opportunity to do that.
Yeah, so we're talking to senior government people now
Right.
to try and avoid the kind of situation we currently have with GDPR, where the war we lost with privacy 30 years ago, regulators are finally trying to catch up to that. We'd like them to be regulating with us as we build out this for-profit peace tech industry, rather than waiting until we see how it has gone badly wrong.
Yeah, but and also hopefully it will be a lively series where people will get sparked and come up with new ideas of their own, that they'll get inspired.
Yeah.
And for the people that we interview, that we can put a spotlight on them, so that way we can direct resources and opportunities for them so they can get big.
Exactly.
I think that would be a great outcome as well.
Yep. A large part of what we do is build the ecosystem, including the capital ecosystem, for this emerging peace tech sector.
Yeah.
So helping, on the one hand, we talk to investors who are saying, this sounds really cool, I want to be part of this, where do I put my money?
Mm-hmm.
And on the other hand, we're talking to startup entrepreneurs who are saying, I want to do a tech startup, I thought I wanted to do something, but I wasn't quite sure, but now that I hear about peace tech, that's what I want to do. We can match make there.
Right. And the really cool thing about doing it in The Hague is that The Hague has the raw ingredients for us to be able to launch a peace tech industry, because we have people who've thought deeply, who are domain experts around peace and justice and security. And so it's just matchmaking the technologists and the innovators with the people with this deep expertise, right? And because we want the responsible deployment of technology as well, we have the people who are looking at policy, law, and those issues as well. So we have a lot of the stakeholders here to catalyze this new sector.
Yeah.
So I'm pretty excited about that. As well as The Hague is a pretty good place. Actually, it's a very cool place to work.
Yeah.
I really enjoy being here.
We have enjoyed it immensely, haven't we?
Yeah, it's a beautiful city.
Yeah. We've actually been talking about, should we maybe put up a blog just about two expats spending more and more time in The Hague and setting up a business in The Hague.
Yeah.
This is a market test to see if any of our listeners can support it.
Right. The real humans of The Hague.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Have we overloaded you guys yet?
I think it was a very insightful talk. Thanks so much.
Okay.
And yeah, well, of
How
course,
long was that? I have no idea.
It was
About half an hour.
yeah.
You're just falling asleep.
That's
Was it half an hour? Oh gosh, it felt longer.